few times a week. I love teaching you. I will be glad to not Zoom anymore, or whatever Google Meet anymore. And we are kind of hurtling towards the end at this point, right? So today, and actually I should say, I assigned you less reading than I thought I even did. For some reason, that I thought that last chapter of Almeida was longer than it was. So you get I'm sure you had a little more time on your hands yesterday or this morning than you had planned to. So I'm thinking of doing some other sort of exercise stuff later in class after going over that a little bit. And also just looking ahead. So Tuesday will be a review session, and we'll try to do that kind of like we did before, right? So I'll try to pull some key concepts from the readings and lectures, and have you guys kind of sit down and on your own for a little while, work out the definitions, the applications, examples of those, and then we'll kind of bring it back in. That'll be Tuesday, and then Thursday will be, again, a take home. Everything's home. You'll be an at-home exam, open book, open whatever, open internet. Don't use the internet though. Really, and actually, maybe I should caution you about that. Just because you'll find stuff that's either bad potentially. If you try to look up something like, I don't know, resource mobilization or framing or something like that, you try to Google that or look at Wikipedia, you're not going to necessarily find what sociologists have to say, right? You're not necessarily going to find mainstream social movements research materials. So I would really caution you not to try to Google stuff, but you should have plenty of material between the Almeida and the Godwin Jasper reading or reader to go with. So don't Google stuff, because that takes you weird places. And I'm gonna wait. I am recording. I am recording. Huh, I'm already recording. I don't remember doing that. All right, weird. See, it messes with your mind. Okay, so all of that said, again, that's next week. For today, let me go back over here, right? Okay, I am back. Whoops. I am back, so erase that. All right, talking then just about, really what's a new directions. I guess this is good to know. Unless you're going on to be a sociological researcher, some of this stuff won't be particularly germane to you, but he does raise some good, important points that we should be at least cognizant of here. So, in terms of defining social movements, clearly we haven't dealt a whole lot with intersectionality. And this is in terms of overlapping or intersecting identities or demographics. We're gonna do a little bit of sort of a quick and dirty case study later in the class, and this sort of occurred to me when looking at some footage of the lockdown protesters, man, there's a lot of there are people. Sorry, it's this. Also, I'm becoming like incoherent. There are people from very different demographic backgrounds participating in those protests, and I think the issue. Well, I mean, that raises a number of issues. Just for example, it's like I see what to me is a surprising number of African Americans participating in lockdown protests in some places. Because what my expectation is that these are mostly the same people who are, would have been the Tea Party 10 years ago. The kind of folks now who show up at Trump rallies, of whom only a vanishingly small fraction are African Americans, right? So my non-scientific way of putting it is what the fuck. What motivates people from these different demographic backgrounds or from different identities to participate in a movement together? And of course, from the standpoint of a movement, you have to be sensitive. If you're a movement organizer, you have to be sensitive to those overlapping identities. And again, I don't know that we did address some of this. But maybe we didn't stress enough that participating in a movement builds a kind of an identity for people. So if you can say, that you were a freedom rider, there's still a number of those folks around. That's a really salient part of your identity. But then that overlaps in interesting ways. It makes the different people's experience of that movement are very different, based on whether they're a man or a woman or lesbian or Hispanic or these different kinds of backgrounds. And we really haven't, I think Almeida's right, paid enough attention to those different demographics and what that means, for people's experience of movement and what that means for how the movement, does their frame bridging, for example, how they reach across those kinds of boundaries to pull in people of different identities. Methodologically, again, this is more towards the inside baseball side of sociology. So for the sociologists in the room, this is something to kind of focus on. If you're not doing research, it's less salient to movement organizers, but it could be salient to movement organizers because I think increasingly, as we kind of saw a little bit in that Gamson piece about the domestic violence network in Rhode Island. That movements are increasingly data driven. So there's certainly a back and forth here between doing the research on the movements and then the movements doing activities, and movements want to know as much about their participants as they can. Want to have ideas about non-participants in order to potentially pull more people into the fold. And so Almeida suggests, and this is kind of just what's going on in general, partly because of big data stuff. We just have increasingly, the ability to find patterns in huge data sets. So partly what we can be doing. Sorry. There it is, Zoom fatigue. All right. Partly what we're talking about is networks, right? So the networks, both of individuals, but also between organizations and geographies. So who gets linked together in a social movement? How do those links form? That's something we don't really know enough about. And like I say, that's in a lot of senses, it's a pretty big data question. So I don't know anybody who's really social scientists who are buying the data from Facebook, but if we could, and somebody certainly should, that's gonna be a huge data dump that you're gonna need some pretty powerful computers to do stuff with, right? So, and some pretty advanced methodologies. So looking at networks using GIS. And this is again overlapping with things like urban sociology, but really, looking at geography, both in terms of where activists are coming from, where mobilized people are coming from, but also for understanding things like dynamics of street protests and those kinds of things, right? So being more geographically aware, and I think sociology is, kind of just in general becoming a bit more geographically aware of the kind of the impacts that space can have, not space, but space, right? Space and place can have on human activities. And this can be just in terms of things like, the way a city is laid out will influence the ability of people to engage in mass actions. That kind of thing will be what we're looking for there. So GIS, that's GIS specifically is a software package, geographic information systems, right? And then kind of mentioned this a bit already, but considering ICT, generally information and communications technology. Again, we've seen some of that, in Occupy, and there was that really interesting breakdown of like telecommunications networks in the Arab Spring. Although, again, I would caution you, it's easy to overdo it. It's easy to put an overemphasis on the role of communications technology, especially vis-a-vis face-to-face communication. And again, like if I was going to try to stage a street protest, I wouldn't try to stage it over Zoom. Just because whether I have a hard enough time knowing from this whether you appear to be understanding the things that I'm saying, let alone whether you would come with me to I don't know, throw Molotov cocktails at the General Electric building or something like that. I don't know. So considering ICT more generally, and what it can do for movements, and specifically, what we saw is, sorry, I'm getting confused between different classes. Social network sites. What was it? Where was it? Social networking sites. Social networking sites. Oh, right. I was reading about that with respect to, and this really, this is super important. So, I say, okay, on the one hand, I say, it's really, it's easy to overstate the role of ICT or social networking in getting people, to mobilize, because, still clearly face-to-face communication is really important. At the same time, though, there are certain movements which we're looking at which seem to be almost entirely facilitated by social networking. So again, I've mentioned to you the incels, to whatever extent they form a movement. You know, they are by their nature antisocial people, right? Who only kind of encounter other human beings on the internet, or largely encounter them on the internet. Also, though, this was in my culture class. We were looking at hate groups, and it's becoming clear that hate groups and really groups like that, ISIS to some extent as well, you know, groups that are doing very illegal stuff, very socially unacceptable stuff, you know, have a much easier time finding each other through social networking sites than they, you know. I've heard weird stories about the Klan, you know, how the Klan used to recruit, you know, and it was just weird. You know, they would, like, you know, somebody would like give you a card or like drop a letter in your mailbox saying, "Hey, come to a Klan meeting." Of course, you don't want to. You know, even if you're like a semi-racist kind of person, you know, showing up at a Klan meeting is kind of dangerous. You know, just because if people find out you're in the Klan, and you know, has potentially some serious consequences for you. But if you like go online and you know, find whatever the Atomwaffen division, or you know, these other extreme right white supremacist groups, you know, you can be in contact with these folks, making plans with them, and at least it feels like nobody knows, right? You may not have to expose that, certainly to your family, you know. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of getting long-winded with this, but Nazis are bad, and we need to know about them. It was really interesting in the wake of Charlottesville. We know that the folks who got together in Charlottesville, the Nazis, and I say Nazis, they're not all Nazis, but you know, I don't feel bad about calling white supremacists in general Nazis, so I'll just say Nazis. The Nazis organized themselves online, and this was actually a fairly rare and unusual meeting of Nazis in real space, in real time. What was really interesting about that is that being engaged in those real world meetings had real world consequences for a number of those Nazis, which clearly, you know, hadn't happened to them before. When they were doing this all online, they could lead this sort of secret Nazi online life. When they came out into the physical world, into physically meeting with one another, and people took photographs of them, a number of people went to, you know, took some pains to we call it dox them, right? To figure out who they were in real life, find out about their jobs, right? Find documents about these people, you know, and some of them, you know, lost jobs and careers because still, fortunately, most people agree that Nazis are bad. Okay, but again, this is a long-winded way of saying, you know, we're going to have to do a lot of research online, and to know the relationships of online movement behaviors to I say meat space, right? Meat, MEAT, meat space. You know, to real, and I hate to say real world. It's all real in a social sense, but you know, to interactions in the physical world, or to interactions in traditional media. Okay. And if anything I'm saying is not making sense, you know, please yell at me or chime in the chat, and I'll hear a ding, and I'll I'll back up for a minute. So that's methods. Theory-wise, he mentions, and of course this is true of the social sciences, especially. I think of sciences in general. Interdisciplinarity, has been the word for 20 or 30 years or so. No less so now. So, clearly we're working with not just sociologists, but political scientists, social psychologists, social anthropologists. Although those guys, let me tell you, who's an anthropologist? Do I have anthropology? Can I be mean to anthropologists? Like, I don't know. I won't be mean. I won't be mean to anthropologists. I'll just say that anthro and soc are kind of coming together a lot more. And I think soc is going to eat a lot of anthro in the next 20 or 30 years, as the defining conditions of anthro as this sort of intercultural thing. We don't have isolated tribes in the rainforest to send people to do field work to anymore. So folks are doing field work. Where sociologists are doing field work too, all these questions of culture that anthropologists and sociologists share, really do come together in movements research. So those kinds of things. Also, I will say, and I'm not quite sure where to stick this in here. This is kind of with this overlap. Kind of close to, so collective identity and emotions research is coming in more. Again, we saw some of that. It was not, so if you recall the article about participation by women in the Salvadoran insurgency, you'll remember that emotions played a role there. There's a lot more in the sociology of emotions that could be brought into movements research, and something that's especially, it might be a fad because so the social sciences are definitely susceptible to fads. Like there's like this one thing that's popular to think about, but type 1 and type 2 thinking, and this comes from cognitive psych and behavioral economics. But it comes out in things like biases. Increasingly, sociologists are worried about sort of the different kinds of thinking that people engage in. So, type 1 thinking is it's called fast cognition. Type 2 thinking is slow or deliberate cognition, and type 1 thinking, is really like those biases that people have in general. Even just in terms of things like racial bias or like the information biases that people have. Clearly there's going to be some import to that. In social movements, in terms of thinking about how do you overcome biases that people have to, I forget which particular, there's like a checklist almost of different cognitive biases that people have, but one important cognitive bias that people have, I guess it's confirmation bias. You tend to believe things that confirm to your way of thinking. And this is just generally a huge problem right now in our society. Our society, I think. Maybe it's always been a problem, but it seems to be especially problematic in the days of coronavirus, when these are life and death issues, that people tend to think they're way smarter than they are, and they tend to think that everything that they already believe is true. So that feeds into this thing of like how anti-vaxxers are now not they don't believe in vaccinations, which is its own problem, but also seem to be not believing that coronavirus is real or is as bad as they say, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Movements research has to face that, and movements organizers clearly have to face that, as they try to, if you, what it suggests is that it's really hard to change people's minds about things. And so how you frame messages, how you try to reach across to new groups is going to have to consider that, when you give people new information, it has to be sort of spoon-fed to them in such a way, or fed to them in some kind of specialized environment that makes them susceptible to overcoming existing biases, right? And I put that in here with emotions, because people do get very emotional. If you tell people they're stupid, they don't like that, surprisingly. Okay, so that, and work on threats, and I think that's kind of related too. In terms of how people perceive things as threats, how people respond to threats. Because as we know, so much social movement activity is really grounded around threats. So we're building a dump, or we're going to nationalize the farms, or we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Some of these things, are not necessarily threatening, right? And again, this kind of comes to a framing question. So it's like, why do people frame? Go back to Charlottesville. Why do people frame taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee as threatening? Because clearly that doesn't affect their material livelihood. So then now we're getting back into like this, this identities thing, this post-material kind of world of people feel threatened when their, whatever you want to call it, their heritage is threatened, something like that. But again, clearly we've got to, especially in this post-material world, conceptualize threats more clearly, or have a certain diversity to how we think about threats. Respecting emergence. So when and how new movements emerge, paying more attention here, as we've seen a bit, the role of non-movement organizations. So, when does a church, what conditions are required for a church to take on, suddenly a role in a social movement, or when does how does one coax a neighborhood association to become active in like the LGBTQ rights movement? Those are clearly things that happen, but we could certainly use more understanding of how those non-movement organizations either become social movements or get folded into social movements. Also, and something that's really on my mind, again with the lockdown protesters, is the role of elites. And again, and this is specifically referring to when elites sponsor movements. And frequently, again, we put that in the rubric of astroturfing. And again, this is sort of, I think I've been suggesting this to you since the beginning, a bit of a problem I have with Almeida's definition of, of saying that movements are all about non-elites, struggling for rights, resources, etc. Clearly elites play a role in sponsoring movements. And sometimes clearly that is, well, it's never, I guess, perfectly clear that it's astroturfing, right? That it's making up a movement or making a fake movement. And it happens on both sides of the political aisle, certainly. So again, I think we're going to take some time look at the lockdown movement. There are elites sponsoring that, so that's coming from the right. Coming from the left, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about George Soros, as sponsoring movement activities on the left, or what people actually say is that George Soros pays people to go to protests and that sort of. There's no I think evidence of that, but Soros does, and other rich dudes, Bill Gates, right, support certain kinds of social movements, right? So how does that work? How does that happen? Why are elites attracted to certain movements? What effect does it have on a movement when you have a big money supporter come in? These are important questions that we don't really have a grasp on quite yet. Framing, not much to really say here. It's clearly still relevant. Maybe even more relevant than ever. As people manipulate frames on the internet. Looking at individual participation, and really here, again, the question generally comes down to what entices some individuals to participate and other very similar individuals not to participate. Clearly some of that stuff, like what Haney and Rojas have been doing in terms of participant surveys. We'll continue to expand our understanding of why individuals participate. But Almeida rightly suggests that we don't really have enough of a sense of what's up with non-participants. This comes from the general outlook of much sociological research as being quasi-experimental, to really understand a population, because, I guess stepping back, it's hard to do experiments on people's social behavior. those dumb YouTube videos of social experiments don't count usually, and especially wouldn't count in something like movements research. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think of like, let's make up a phony social movement and like have a control group and a treatment group, of people who you tell, one thing about the social movement, and people you tell another thing, and then you see the participation rate. No, you can't do that, right? So by nature, most sociological research is quasi experimental, and so your control group is not really a group that you chose, but it is part of the population in general. We really don't know too much about those folks who don't participate. So we're taking surveys of people who do participate. We can try to compare them along demographic lines to non-participants. But clearly, there are lots of people who are, very similar demographically, have very similar cultural experiences to participants, but they don't participate. What's up with them? We just need better survey designs, or to some extent, this could be something that you include in some of the larger social surveys that we have, like the GSS. But again, that data doesn't really exist in a significant way at this point, so we do need to figure that out. And again, more social media studies here. And Almeida refers to it. I don't know if he's thinking about like Facebook invites in specific, or if he's just talking about the kind of broader messaging as being an invitation. But here the question kind of is what sorts of messaging, what sorts of invitation, what sorts of events, as disseminated through social media, can conjure, can elicit mobilization in individuals. Outcomes. Hard stuff to study here, especially, but important things to focus on would be like cultural outcomes. So, and again, this was when we were discussing the couple classes back. We're talking about like the failure of the women's movement. It's like it's a failure from certain points of view. We can question, people do question, if it's a real cultural failure, because so much in the culture has changed, because of, or at least in part because of the women's movement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Assessing that in any kind of clear-headed way is difficult, but important. So what is the cultural outcome of the women's movement? And that might be down to analyzing things, like surveys to see if people's opinions in general change because of those movements. It might be down to things like content analysis, and seeing what sort of issues get reported on, or how issues get reported on before and after social movement activity. Because on the one hand, he brings up the women's movement or the women's march. On the one hand, it doesn't seem like the women's march did a whole lot. On the other hand, it seems like that might have some responsibility, for a broader awakening in consciousness, for things like the Me Too movement, for things like how heavily Brett Kavanaugh was scrutinized during his confirmation hearings, those kinds of things. Can we link those cultural outcomes, or can we link, those cultural phenomena to movements in such a way we can say that they're outcomes? And then, of course, just transnationally, we can ask, do movement activities in one country affect movement activities in other places? And also, we still need to understand more about conditions for success. Although, it really depends. I think a lot of this, we could frame in terms of the sort of global South studies that Almeida is so involved in. And it becomes very, let's say, complicated, right? It's why does a popular revolution work in one place and not in another place? We can find some common denominators some of the time, but so much of that really does have to do with particularities of history that I'm not sure how successful we'll ever be in terms of really generalizing the conditions for success. With respect to the global South specifically, we're continuing to look more at movements towards democratization. But that is in the face of repression, right? And there's no sign. I think he, I don't know. I'd kind of like to pick the guy's brain at some point as to where he's coming from with some of this stuff. He seems really optimistic about the Arab Spring, but in 2018 he shouldn't have been. Those were movements towards democratization. I think pretty much across the board, all those revolutions, with the exception maybe of Tunisia, and somebody like Professor Birch should be better on this because he studied it specifically. But as far as I know, most of those revolutions weren't successful, and where they have been successful, the democratization has really been rolled back. So the efforts towards democracy, I guess what could we say? It's a long road to democracy with a lot of setbacks along the way. I think too about Aung San Suu Kyi, right, in Burma. What do they call it? Myanmar, Burma. I'm not sure which one's acceptable right now. But they had an extremely repressive military regime for a couple generations, and then they democratized, and Suu Kyi, who is a Nobel Prize winner for her pro-democracy activism, becomes the president. But then she, essentially oversees or turns a blind eye to the repression of the Rohingya in Burma. So it's global South, just not happy stories, right? Every move towards democracy seems to be met with for at least for every 2 steps forward, there's 1 step back, if not 2 or 3 steps backward. And again, transnational initiatives are important here, and that may be, maybe that's the last great hope, or the next great hope, is that as we do live in an increasingly globalized world, there can be more exchanges across boundaries to so that lessons learned in one place or resources used in one place can also translate to resources for somewhere else. And then he has these like three big things, and I think he's generally right about these. So things to pay attention to, that are sparking social movements, sparking social change, economic inequality. Mostly, I think he actually gets this a little wrong. It's most important at the national scale because overall global inequality between nation inequality is dropping. Within nation inequality is on the rise. So within societies, economic inequality is getting worse. Certainly, that is the root of much mobilization in the global north at this point. Authoritarianism, and this is really not just speaking to the global south, but really worldwide. And that comes in the terms of the erosion of human rights. Yeah, it's happening in the global south. Like I say, it happened in basically all of those nations that had won some additional democracy from the Arab Spring. More repressive regimes kind of went back in. But we're also talking, in terms of the United States. So there has been a visible erosion of human rights in the United States since the election of Trump, and we see that in terms of things like immigrant detentions, in terms of things like press freedoms have been eroded, and of course that's happening in Western Europe as well. And partly, there is some should note, some tie between these. And I would add here, he doesn't really talk about it, but globalization seems to be sparking all of this to some extent as well. So there are people in our nation and other nations that take advantage of globalization to build fantastic fortunes, and then there are people who get screwed, like the American working class. As jobs have gone away to Mexico and Japan, but that makes people ripe for authoritarianism, right? So you see, again, it's certainly not just Trump who comes in and says like, oh, they're taking your jobs, foreigners are bad, China gives you a virus. Let's make America great again. That's his specific line that opens up a avenue for him to invoke, various authoritarian policies. But he's far from alone in doing that, and there's rising support, really across Europe. So we see this in England with Brexit. We see this in Italy with the increased support for far-right authoritarian parties. The Allianz für Deutschland in Germany is doing this. The rise of Marine Le Pen in France, right? All of this does speak to that broader trend towards authoritarianism, as Almeida suggests. His final suggestion, of course, is climate change, and clearly, there's a global movement built around climate change, built around both trying to mitigate the ongoing carbon emissions, and also, though, and increasingly, I think we're going to see. I don't think everybody thinks we're going to see increasing mobilization around the effects of climate change. This is the biggest threat. Really, I don't think it's hyperbole to say this is the biggest threat that human civilization has ever faced, because obviously people who are living in low-lying areas, farmers, everybody's going to experience various threats from climate change, and clearly people have begun to mobilize. People will increasingly be mobilizing around those threats, to do, say in some cases, to do things as simple as to plead with their government to find them places to live because their homes are underwater, that kind of thing. And I will finally note here, just to be timely, COVID-19, clearly it's already sparked a weird social movement, in terms of the anti-lockdown protests. But and we'll read a couple articles in a minute about this. I also want you to think about how COVID-19 may sort of change people's relationship to authority structures, change their understanding of authority structures, and it really could go a variety of different ways. So what I'm talking about here is, on the one, at the most positive, and I should just say, sociologists think community is a positive thing. At the most positive level, this would be an increased move towards communitarianism, where we see people supporting one another, supporting their local communities, banding together to. You've read the. You've read the articles online, or you've seen the Instagram posts or whatever about, the building got together and gave a stack of DVDs to the little old lady in apartment 420 who nobody ever knew she lived there, or something like that. It's like, so that could be a real and lasting impact, that we have gotten away from, in an increasingly balkanized society. At the same time, I think part of what the lockdown crew, the anti-lockdown crew, is worried about. Sorry, I think I'm trying not to go to the really wackiest of spaces where there are folks who think that this is somehow a 5G conspiracy, where they're putting in 5G and ultimately potentially like mind control. Not that necessarily, but I think there is, at least we could consider that as people are now submitting to significant abridgment of their civil liberties, right? So you do have. These folks aren't wrong. You have the right to free and peaceable assembly and all that kind of thing. It could be that people are more accepting of the government telling them that they can or can't do things. That may change some of our norms about how accepting we are of authoritarian structures. And we'll see in one of these articles that we're about to read The other really interesting, and really unprecedented in our lifetimes dimension here is a notion that let me just finish writing this. Demand for, say, government competence. For a long time, since the Reagan administration, although some of the seeds of this, and this is speaking, obviously to the U.S. case, but clearly I think it's got parallels globally. But just speaking to the U.S. case, since the 1980s, again, the seeds were sown earlier. There has been a growing, I wouldn't call it a consensus, but an increasingly large proportion of the population who believes in shrinking the government and shrinking the welfare state in particular. And that was a huge turnaround from a groundwork that was laid in the 1930s. The last time we really saw a dramatic expansion of the welfare state was during the Great Depression, right? We're in a depression. Obviously, it's COVID-19 related. It probably won't be as long and deep as the Great Depression or even the Great Recession. But people are demanding that the government, essentially, give them handouts now. People who would never take a government handout are now saying, like, so small businesses need these loans and these grants. Workers need loans and grants. The CARES Act checks that some of you and most of your parents got, there were just like direct payments from the government. This is a huge expansion of the welfare state, and there is some, I guess some people are concerned. Some of us are interested to see like what the long-term political impact of that is, and whether that sparks additional movement activity, over the next generation to maybe build a full-on welfare state in the United States, as European countries have. That's a possibility. Maybe overnight we just forget that this ever happened, but it's certainly worth looking into. More broadly, again, part of the movement since the Reagan administration has been to shrink the government and say that government can't solve problems. People solve problems on their own. Americans pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Blah blah blah. Now, I think a much wider swath of the population is accepting of the idea that there are certain problems that you need a big government to solve and to prepare for. And again, whether that's responding to natural disasters, whether that's responding to pandemics, whether that branches out into other things like transit infrastructure and schooling and Head Start and all those other kinds of programs. This remains to be seen, but I think, COVID-19, may well be a watershed moment in American politics. Again, remains to be seen. Sometimes we do say we have a very short memory or a short attention span. So, if this thing turns around quickly, maybe we forget, and maybe you can just ignore this, but I don't think that's going to happen. Okay, now a bit of an exercise kind of on on that theme here. So if you go to Moodle, you'll see I've posted a couple of articles about this brand new social movement, right? So we have, we're uniquely in a position. We're lucky enough to have witnessed the rise of a brand new social movement during this class, and that is this anti-lockdown movement. So there's an article on the New York Times, kind of generally about the protest. There's an article on Vox, which is actually it's an interview with one of the great what would you I don't want to call her it seems kind of sexist to call her the grand dame of social movements research, but that kind of is what she is. Theda Skocpol is really a towering figure in social movements research, partly because where is it? She wrote this big book long time ago. This is 1980. This is 1979. Theda Skocpol wrote this in 1979. I think it came out of her dissertation. Comparative analysis of revolutions globally. So there's an interview with Skocpol on Vox. So read both of those things. Maybe take about 15, 20 minutes or so. Read those two articles, and then we're going to apply our knowledge, right? So similar to what you just did with the case studies. Then we're going to ask and answer these questions, right? So what are their goals? What's their organization? What are their tactics? Who's there? What's the framing? What are the resources? How have they interacted with the environment and success? We might be a little early to see success. We can talk about if you know or not if they've been successful. We'll talk about that. Oops. Okay. So please read those articles, and then we'll come back for a discussion. Okay, if we can, sorry, if we can come back together now and take a look at these. So what does, can I edit this? Can I? Yes. What does the anti-lockdown movement want? In the near or the short term? And you can turn on your mic or hop in the chat window. Anti-lockdown. What do they want? I can only see one face in here. Does that mean everybody else is just, they turned on their computers and they went away? Okay, no, there they are. Okay, thank you. Demanding freedom, right? And opening things up. Good. Okay, so freedom, open up, and I'm going to say open up the economy. That seems to be thing, but probably Shoney's and whatever, Burger King too. Constitutional rights, right? Certain constitutional rights, like the right to protest, right? You saw the one anti-abortion group, right? Like they're suing because they want to get back on with protesting abortion clinics, which are probably closed anyway. But anyhow, good, yeah. Right, government involvement. Okay, good. How were they organized? And this maybe wasn't totally clear from the article, right? So, right, social media, right, definitely. Right, so using posts on Facebook's top-down influence, and who's at the top, right? Pro-Trump nonprofits, yeah. I mean, and you do get a little bit. Well, I want to say it's a little bit conspiracy theory-ish about the whole pro-Trump thing, but at the same time, you see both the Times and Scotch Poll are documenting those links. So you actually find like links to people who've been in the administration and law firms and so on and so forth. So it's not really a conspiracy theory. It may not actually be a conspiracy per se, but it is like-minded people working towards a like-minded goal through this organization, right? And so this is a good example of that involvement of the elites, like Almeida was talking about. What else do we have? We're kind of starting to get short on time. Tactics. What's the main tactic here? Protests, right? And I don't know, and this may be like, I don't think the article's really covered it. Have you seen like some of the protests? Like what sets these apart from other kinds of protests? Or maybe even, why are these protests different than like your average, like, 20 guys on the steps of City Hall? Right. Social distancing, right? That makes this different. That makes this kind of weird, and somebody mentioned like, what was it like these are like live free or die people. It's like we are living in a time when like getting in a large group of people could actually kill you, right? So that in and of itself is kind of weird, or I guess spectacular. So, right, protests despite social distance. What I found really kind of is what I found kind of additionally interesting was that some of these are truck protests. So right, or yeah, blocking hospitals. Right, that's a bizarre one. I gotta say, like, tactic wise, in terms of trying to do bridging and open up your move, probably not a good way to get popular. Just putting that out there. But yeah, but using vehicles, right? So it's like folks, they don't want the social distancing order to be in place, but they still, at least some part of them, respect the idea of social distancing. We're going to stay in our car and protest and honk our horn, but I don't want to catch coronavirus, or maybe it's these policies are good for me, but not for everybody else. I'm not sure. So, but puts us in a really kind of in a kind of funny place. Whoa, that's not what I do. This. Okay. So those are tactics. Who are these people? Who is? Whoa, I messed some stuff up. Okay. Yeah, sorry. Who has been recruited to the movement, and did you figure out how? Fox News watchers, right? Right. Conservatives, more general, but there's still there's still definitely some gaps in our understanding about this, and I don't I do know um, several social guys who go out and do research at protests. I don't know if I was telling you guys, I have one sociologist friend at Madison, Wisconsin, and he's looking out his window after he posts to Facebook these protests. So I don't know that we really have too clear an idea, specifically like demographically who these folks are. But yeah, clearly they're people who are in that conservative world. Whether it's the other thing though is as a lot of the reporting points out, these are apparently fringe people, even at that. So there are right, so anti-government kind of folks. So even a Alex Jones people, probably, right. So even a small subset of conservatives, right. I'm sure Fox News's demographic is like really old people, so I'm sure that there's plenty of really old people who are like terrified at the idea of going out. Yeah, but I mean, the Alex Jones people is also it's a good kind of um, metaphor almost, or is it a metonymy? It would be people who are more into that fringe media, who are pushing fringier ideas about this being like government intrusion or something along those lines. I guess one last question, and then we're going to have to go for the day. What's the framing? What's the frame here? What's the why be anti-lockdown? How does this appeal, or how do they try to make this appeal to people beyond just the Alex Jones conspiracy theorists? Right. So that kind of an appeal. You have the right to decide how to live your life. So kind of self determination, right? Good American value, the good, big government scary card, right? Those kinds of things, right? Or what's the way that they sometimes put Big Brother? right? You know, it's all, oh, big evil government, right? Um, right, right. The government, if the government's going to do this, might they stretch out into something else and take your rights away, right? Control you. Good. Okay. Good. Thank you guys for having a look at this stuff, and I think pay attention generally to what's going on, and I think subsequent to this, there are going to be people who need various kinds of help based on the COVID emergency. What kind of social movements that creates, are going to be. It's going to be important for us to watch, and it's going to influence really how much of activism plays out for at least the short and the medium term future. Okay, so thanks for coming today. We'll do some online review on. Well, I guess we'll do everything online. We'll do a review on Tuesday in preparation of your final exams on Thursday. So thank you guys, and I will see you soon.